Good evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Paul. I'm a professor in the Departments of History and Classics, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. This is the fourth annual lecture to be sponsored by the Classics Department's Modern Greek Studies Fund, which is made possible by the generosity of James and Sandra Boggers. And we're delighted to have Jim with us today. Thank you, Jim, for all your support. I'm also grateful to Professor Nanoma Renatos at the University of Illinois in Chicago, who has collaborated with us to make this event possible. Well, it's an immense privilege to introduce and to welcome back, after 12 years, to the University of Chicago, my friend and mentor, Paul Cartledge, who is the A.G. Levendis Professor of Greek Culture Emeritus and A.G. Levendis Senior Research Fellow at Clare College in the University of Cambridge. To say that Paul Cartledge is a prolific author would be a gross understatement. Apart from the hundreds of articles, possibly more than 1,000 by now, contributing chapters and reviews that he has penned, he is the author of, on my count, and it's difficult to count up, but around about 20 books, and the editor or co-editor of at least 9 others. The terrain over which his writing ranges is vast, from authors such as Aristophanes, Democritus, and Xenophon, to individuals such as Alexander the Great, and from political theory to how the Greek citizen constructed his identity. I'm thinking here of The Greeks, A Portrait of Self and Others, which was first published in 1993 and then came out in a second edition in 2002. But alongside his deeply learned monographs, Paul has for a long time exhibited a fierce commitment to popularizing the field of Greek history. And when I say popularized, I mean the term not in the pejorative sense that scholars sometimes employ to mark their disapproval, but in the sense of to democratize, to demystify, and to demonstrate the world of the ancient Greeks need not be the narrow preserve of an elite intelligentsia. One thinks in this mould of his book, The Greeks, Crucible of Civilization, which was published in 2000, or his Ancient Greece, A History in 11 Cities, published in 2009, together with its spin-off, Ancient Greece, A Very Short Introduction, 2 years later. A deft blend of both the scholarly and the accessible is on show in his most recent book, After Thermopylae, The Oath of Plataea and the End of the Greco-Persian Wars, which was published in 2013. Following his 2006 book, Thermopylae, The Battle That Changed the World, After Thermopylae focuses on the Battle of Plataea, arguing for its importance not only in the course of Greek history, but especially in terms of its nachleibon, as they were articulated in various traditions surrounding the so-called Oath of Plataea. Professor Cartledge is, however, perhaps best known for his work on Sparta, a commitment to laconophilia that has earned him the grant of honorary citizenship from the Demos of Sparta. His first book, Sparta and Laconia, A Regional History 1300 to 362 BC, was published in 1979 and grew out of his Oxford D.Phil thesis, which was actually more archaeological. I still can't get over the fact that it was supervised by Sir John Baldwin. It's become essential reading for any student of Greek history, which is why it was re-released as a second edition in 2002. Sparta and Laconia was followed in 1987 by the monumental Agesilaus and the Crisis of Sparta, and in 1989 by Hellenistic and Roman Sparta, A Tale of Two Cities, co-written with Tony Spalforth. 2001 saw the publication of Spartan Reflections, an extremely useful collection of chapters and articles that Paul has published in a variety of venues, and some of my undergraduate students read from that for this morning. And in 2003, he was the chief consultant for Bettany Hughes' Channel 4 series, The Spartans, for which he also wrote the accompanying book, The Spartans, The World of the Warrior Heroes of Ancient Greece. And it is on the theme of Sparta, and especially the image of Sparta today, that Paul will speak this evening with the title, A Tarnished Dawn, Ancient Sparta's Perception Today and tomorrow. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Cartledge.
Axiotimi Kyrios ke Kyrie, Philemu Jonathan, and especially Mr. Jim Gomez, says Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ for your generosity in sponsoring this occasion. As Jonathan has said, it is indeed not my first trip here. I actually came to Chicago first in 1967, when I was a little bit younger than I am now. And this is my fourth visit, and I was very privileged to be here as a visiting scholar in 2003, when one of my former PhD students, Daniel Allen, was in post here and was indeed a dean as well as a very distinguished researcher and teacher. My relationship with Jonathan goes back even further than with Danielle, and I believe I did examine your thesis, if I'm right, yes, in Cambridge, which was done under Professor Anthony Snodgrass. And Snoddy and I share a doctor father whom we like to jokingly refer to as Yanis Pinakanthropos, otherwise known as John Boardman. So, there is a filiation and a lineage to our getting together this evening. So, thanks to all of those, thanks to you for coming, and I hope enjoying this evening. And please feel free at any point to intervene if there's something in the slide that catches your attention, I pass over it, you would like to say something, please come on in, or at the end, obviously, I shall leave time for questions, interventions, comments, discussion, whatever. And I'd like to thank, finally, the extremely congenial and genius, technologically speaking, former PhD student of mine, Dr. Carol Atack, but for whom you would not be looking at any slides whatsoever. Because though I'm not strictly a Luddite, and I'm not entirely technophobic, I am entirely technically challenged, and therefore, but for her. Okay, so you have, I hope, a handout. It's not absolutely essential to have it to follow what I'm saying. It's really, if you wish afterwards to follow up anything that I've said or any particular aspect of what I say, there are some references here. And do feel free, obviously, to email me, and I've put my email address at the top of the handout in case. So I do begin with item 1 on the handout, which is that Sparta, ancient Sparta, it's one index of how, of course, in general, all history is contemporary history. In other words, history means nothing unless it has a contemporary reflection, resonance, or importance. But Sparta has made its mark, ancient Sparta, on our Euro-American Western culture in a very specific linguistic way. Not just one, not just two, but 3 English words are derived from ancient Sparta. Now, some of you may have heard of a nostrum that is peddled by neoliberal economists, and it goes under the title of austerity. Well, what was being Sparta if it was not being austere? And this is a word that we still habitually use. I come across it regularly in the public prints to mean precisely self-denying, which is not something that actually most of us these days are brought up to be as a kind of dominant moral paradigm. And perhaps it's time we were, but nevertheless, we will explore other dimensions of what it is to be Spartan now and what it was then, later on. Secondly, laconic. How do you get laconic from Sparta? Well, the answer is via lacones, which is an alternative term for the ancient Spartans. And they were very greedy, the Spartans. They had not just one, not just two, they had 3 words, 3 titles whereby they described themselves. And the third was Lacedaemonioi. We're going to come back to that. Lacedaemon originally was a geographical term. It turns up in Homer, and it refers to a particular portion of the southeast Peloponnese. And it gives you the official word for the ancient Spartan state. We sometimes say Washington said this, Berlin agreed that. Well, the ancients never used the concrete physical place to stand as a synecdoche for the political community, because for them, citizens were the political community. So they always referred to their political community, their polis, by their collective personal name. So the Spartans were Lacedaemonioi because the official title of the Spartan state was Lacedaemon. But they were also, if they were born of the right parents, brought up in the right way, passed through the educational system, were elected to a common mess where they lived in a Spartan manner. They were also Spartiati. And actually, Jonathan and I, earlier this afternoon, were looking at the text, which turned up in Oxyrhynchus. It was found, therefore, in Egypt in the late 19th century, and it was only published in the 1970s. And it contains the very first use of the technical title for the Spartans, Spartiati, except it comes out because Tertius used a Homeric dialect, as all poets did then pretty much, as Spartiation. So it's in the genitive plural, it's of the Spartiates. So 3 words we derive. So what's the third? Well, it's on your handout, and it's helot. And that's not perhaps a word that passes your lips on a daily basis. But look in the dictionary, and you'll find it. It's used to define those persons who are in a subordinate state or status within a community, typically economic, whereby their labour power is exploited in an exploitative manner. And so, for example, in the apartheid years of South Africa, the term was readily applied, and I think perfectly fairly, to the blacks of South Africa, who were not citizens, they were not even persons, they weren't technically slaves, and it's very important. Helots are not strictly unfree, they're not owned, wholly owned by any other individual, but they are deprived of their liberty to such an extent that it is an extreme form of oppression and depersonalization. Hence the helots, as it were, of South Africa. But what's surprising, what is so important about this word in its original signification is that it means captive. Now, slavery, this is I'm sure well known to everybody, was extremely widespread. And there are different forms of unfreedom. And the ancient Greeks, some of them, developed one of the most unpleasant forms of unfreedom that can be imagined, and that is the wholly owned commodification of a person, such that they are no longer treated at law as a person, but as a thing. And chattel slavery, as it's called, is actually very rare. Slavery is very common, still very common, sadly, but chattel slavery is very rare. In ancient Greece, probably the best known, the most fully developed exponent of chattel slavery was Athens. The helots were, according to one use of the term, slaves, but they were not chattel slaves. They had families, they had wives referred to as such, children. They reproduced themselves as a slave class. Well now, that poses a very different problem of management from the problem posed by chattel slaves. In my own humble opinion, it is actually the determinant single fact about ancient Sparta. So it's quite, I think, interesting that that's somehow survived or been probably reinvented for current use. So what I'm talking to you about for about 45 minutes now is what's been, and this is item 2 on your handout, variously referred to as the Spartan tradition, or Le Mirage Spartian. Those of you who are Dynasty fans, remember that soap opera? There was a hotel called La Mirage, and I winced every time I heard this terrible solecism. It's Le Mirage Spartian. Or if you are a Swede called Eugene Napoleon Tigerstedt, I think it's one of the great names, you write about the legend of Sparta in classical antiquity. Or if you're Moses Finley, later Sir Moses Finley, whose position I, in fact, succeeded to as a lecturer in Cambridge in 1979, you write about more generally the myth of Sparta. So that is the subject today. I shall say something about the ancient Spartans, as I've already begun to say, but I shall be saying also a great deal about the modern reception and perception, or is it misperception, of Sparta and Spartans in the 20th and 21st centuries in particular. So, if you believe I'm reading out this ad, business travellers should live a Spartan existence. Remember, the Spartans were defeated. This must surely be the single most scholarly ad that has ever been. Actually, it provoked literature, amongst advertising. Why was this so successful? We're talking about the 80s, we're back in the 1980s. Hyatt chain still going. As I came in from O'Hare, there was a Hyatt hotel. I taught yesterday at the Greek consulate. Opposite the Greek consulate is the main, I think, Hyatt hotel. Yeah, so I was very pleased to see it still going strong. Well, somebody had read, not then yet my book, because it wasn't quite out, so it was actually central, the book that Jonathan mentioned, Agesilaus and the Crisis of Sparta. But the joke was the Spartans were defeated at the Battle of Leuctra. And you see, the reason for this was they hadn't had a decent night's sleep the night before in a comfy hotel room offered by the Hyatt Regency hotel chain. So that is one humorous exploration of the Spartan myth, legend, tradition. I'm going to be introducing you to other dimensions of the Spartan tradition, which are very much less comical or salubrious. And when I was awarded, as Jonathan said, the honorary citizenship of Sparta, we had a very big event. Actually, I think there were probably more Greek archaeologists than there were British, but it was a British school, Greek Archaeological Service joint event. And I gave a little introduction to begin with, and an acceptance speech of the Spartan citizenship, in which I dwelt more on what I call the dark side of the Spartan myth, mirage, tradition, legend, than on the bright side. So I'm going to be dealing in chiaroscuro today, as I typically do in any case. So let's start off with again, in the less happy dimension. This is the dark side of the Hellas. And if you can see, it's rather small, but on the lower right side of the slide here, you see a slave master whipping workers who are agricultural. And this is a plough, a scratch plough. And the main function of the Hellas was indeed to produce the wherewithal, the material substance, especially food, which enabled the Spartans, the Spartiates, especially the adult male warrior section of the Spartan community, not to have to do any productive work whatsoever, apart from war, insofar as war was, as Aristotle stressed, a means of production. Along with the men, of course, this liberated the Spartan women from having to work in the ways that other Greek women had to. And I shall be coming back to their status, their ambiguous, their rather sort of puzzling status in the Greek world later on, and as represented in modern media, no less than in ancient media. Some of you here perhaps are runners. Some of you perhaps are long-distance runners. Some perhaps even marathon runners, perhaps even on a competitive basis. Well, you guys are regarded with something of, not exactly contempt, but at any rate less than huge admiration by a very special breed of person called an ultra-marathoner. And I'm going to show you two, and this one is the most distinguished in terms of competitive excellence. The second one I'm going to show you is perhaps my favourite ultra-marathon. I communicate with him by email. I've not yet met him, but I'll try to explain why I'm so fascinated by him shortly. So, Yannis John, and some of you will instantly perhaps think of Agios Ioannis the Prodromos, the forerunner. So he's divinely well named as Yannis Kouros. Kouros is a youth. But in particular, those of you who've been recently to the British Museum or the Met in New York, I will have seen kouroi, which is a kind of technical term for an entirely naked youth. And actually, Yannis Kouros is rather dressed up, but my next subject wears rather less, or sometimes wears rather less. Yannis Kouros comes from Archaeology, in particular from Tripolis, which some of you know is en route to Sparta. And the Spartathlon, a competition, a prize, added on to Sparta, gives you a competition involving Sparta, which is a very, very long-run race. It was invented in the 1980s, again, like the Hyatt Regency ad, by some members of the British Royal Air Force. And they were inspired by, not a Spartan, but an Athenian, who once, and this is in the pages of Herodotus, so it must be true, ran from Athens to Sparta at the request of the Athenian people, who, faced with a massive invasion from Persia by sea, prompted by King Darius, wanted the help of the best warriors in the then Greece of the early 5th century BC, BCE, namely the Spartans. And the runner in question, I'm absolutely confident his name was Philippides, not the joke. This is Aristophanes' joke, I think, Phaidippides, which means spare the horses, Phaidamai hippos, so you run, you spare the horses by running. Philippides, very good aristocratic Athenian name, also horsey, so aristocratic. Philippides was not just a hemerodromes, which means a day runner, so he ran all day and night as well, but he was also an ambassador, because he had a message to convey, which was, come and help us. Why should you come and help us? Well, and here are the following reasons. And he was very successful. He got to Sparta, Herodotus says, on the second day, which means more than 24 hours after leaving Athens and less than 48 hours. Pretty good time for 150 miles or 6 marathons, and involving having to run overnight over very rough terrain in the dark. And this is roughly August, I suppose. We're talking about 490 BC. So he gets to Sparta, persuades the Spartans that they should help the Athenians, but the Spartans say, and Herodotus believes them, there is a religious impediment why we cannot immediately send our troops to help you. And that is because of the phase of the moon. We're in the middle of a festival. When the moon changes, then we will be in a position, and indeed, as soon as the moon had changed, they sent a force, terrific forced marches, and they get to Marathon, which is of course 26 miles beyond Athens, and they get there the day after the battle. Now, I'm quite convinced that the genius behind the Greek victory, the Athenian Plataean victory at Marathon, Miltiades, was very aware the Spartans were coming, but he didn't want the Spartans to share the glory, and therefore the battle took place before they arrived. Spartans are said to have come to the battle, looked over the battle scene and said, fantastic job, boys, and then gone back. And of course it was a fantastic job. 192 dead, not 193, not 191, 192 against allegedly 6,400, which is a rounded figure, on the Persian side. Now, why am I going on such a, what is the relation of this to the legend? Well, isn't it a bit odd that a race is founded which has Sparta in the title? It's from Athens to Sparta, but actually the Battle of Marathon was not won by Sparta. They weren't there. So it's the Athenians who took the glory, and indeed deprived the Plataeans of it as well, for the most part. So it's an example of how a myth can grow up. This is a modern one now, not an ancient one, around an event which actually is misconstrued, because it's not the best way of celebrating Sparta, but that was the sort of goal of setting up this race, which now has been going on for about 30 years. And he's run the 2 fastest times, and he holds the record 20 hours, 25 minutes. So 6 times a marathon, on average 3.5 hours for each marathon consecutively. And I'm not sure, yes, I have put on the handout, typically English book. By an Englishman, he prepared for ages, several years. He'd run all sorts of other marathons, really tough, some longer than a single marathon. This is Robin Harvey on your handout. But when it came to it, he managed only about 80 of the 150 miles. Ignominiously, he collapsed. He had to be picked up by the bus, which was waiting there, to take all such walking wounded or not walking wounded to Sparta. So they took him to the end of the race, where he says he found himself in rather like a military hospital after the Battle of the Somme. These were all the casualties of this extraordinary demanding race. Well, my next subject, fortunately, did not suffer that ignominy. Originally Konstantinos Karnazes, is all Greek, because both his parents are Greek, but he's also all American, because he was born in or near San Francisco, where he was raised, where he still lives. And he is Mr. Ultra Marathon Man. That is actually the title of the book about him. And I'll just give you one illustration of his extraordinary feats. He's not necessarily the fastest marathon runner or ultra marathon runner, but his stride pattern, his weight ratio, the way in which he carries himself is the most efficient possible according to all ergonomic tests. And so you can keep going, as it were, forever. At any rate, at one point he ran 50 marathons on 50 consecutive days in all 50 United States. And those of you who know your geography, apart from the landmass of the United States, Hawaii is, I think, something like a 6-hour jet flight from LAX. So by the time he got there, he'd been jet-lagged as well as knackered from all the others that he'd been doing. Well, there he is in much more ancient guise. It's like a kouros. He is covering his modesty, and he is wearing shoes, but he's naked from the waist up. And he's writing a book, and it's of course going to be a fictionalized account of his hero, his mentor, his model. I'm sorry to say he calls him Phidippides, but Philippides, Phidippides. So watch this space. Well, the race ends in Sparta, somewhere near this monument, which is of course a modern monument. And it's modelled on another modern monument, which I'm going to come back to later. And it contains an inscription, and it tells you who set up, who paid for the sculpture and so on. And this is, of course, Leonidas. But is it? Well, let me move on to the next slide. This particular artifact, Parian marble from the island of Paros, incomplete of course, but has one distinctively Spartan feature, apart from the fact that it was excavated in the 1920s, just at the foot of the Acropolis Hill, or what passes for an Acropolis in Sparta. And the Greek workmen, when they took the earth off, uncovered this remarkable figure, instantly said, Leonidas. Actually, sadly, art historically, it's probably to be dated to the 1980s. Sorry, the 480s, therefore before an interesting slip, ancient and modern. Probably therefore to the decade before he died at the Battle of Thermopylae. The style, the attitude, other finds make it clear that he's not a solo figure. So in other words, he's part of a group, originally a pedimental group, from some religious shrine. So he represents not a living human, or dead living human, but a hero of some kind. Now you might say, well, the king of Sparta, when he died, was made into a hero, so that would be appropriate. But in Sparta, of all places, the notion of individuating any one person by a very un-Spartan kind of memorial or monument, as would have been a named statue. There were hardly any in Athens, a much more individualistic community than Sparta. So for all those reasons, cultural, art historical, this can't surely be actually Leonidas. However, there is one feature of him that is particularly Spartan. We're in Movember, aren't we? I expect many of you, I mean the men, are perhaps not shaving your upper lips during this month. Well, this is a fetish in England, at any rate. Well, the Spartans did exactly the opposite. They grew a beard, but they shaved their moustaches. And this turns up not only on this image, but also on various bronzes. And it has literary, written authority, because it said, when the chief officials who were elected every year, 5 of them, came into office, the first edict, the first pronouncement that they made to all Spartans was, shave your moustaches and obey the laws. Obviously, obeying the laws was the more important of the two injunctions. But the point is order, right? Uniform. Every Spartan male must look as much as possible like every other Spartan male. So, no moustaches, but beard. This is also, of course, a magnificent work of art. There is a ram's head to symbolize the extreme masculinity and virility of this warrior. And does anybody happen to know where this sculpture currently is? It's in the Field Museum. And in about 3 weeks' time, it will be unveiled to gasps, we hope, of astonishment and admiration. He normally lives in Sparta, but he's on a world tour. And he's been in Canada, and he's come very recently to Chicago. So I asked Bill Parkinson, is he unwrapped yet? No, he's still under wraps in the Field Museum. So tomorrow we have a panel discussion at the National Hellenic Museum involving Bill, myself, a couple of others. We'll be talking about the use of archaeology in current discussions of politics, and who knows, he might conceivably get a mention. So this is the other, perhaps the more famous, as it were, the original modern Leonidas. And he's at Thermopylae, Thermopylae in Greek, hot gates. And he stands pretty much opposite where the last stand of the Spartans was made in August of 480 BC, BCE. Now, what to me is puzzling about this, and of course I'm not the first person to have noticed this, is the battle in which he died. He died heroically. It was a defeat. I mean, quite a major defeat. It enabled Xerxes, who had been nearly held up for a while and suffered some losses, both physical and spiritual. Nevertheless, it was a defeat. And so the celebration of Thermopylae, as if it were a victory, is paradoxical, to put it no higher than that. Alongside him is, as you probably know, some of you have been to this place, a very recent monument, much more recent than this. This goes back to the mid-50s. Greek and Americans got together and paid for this one. A little bit further to the north is a monument to the people of Thespiae. Thespies today, Thespiae. And they sent every man they could to fight as a hoplite under Leonidas' command. And we're told that every one of them died. the Spartans sent not 300, but 301 Spartans, Leonidas, plus 300. And of those, only 299 died, because Herodotus makes quite clear that 2 of the 300 survived the battle of Thermopylae, which rather spoils the idea that every one of them died to a man, but actually most of them, of course, did. So in other words, there were something like 8,000 Spartans of adult military age, but probably only a few hundred, maybe a few thousand Thespians. So proportionately, the Thespians sacrificed much more. Yet this battle is remembered, though it was a defeat, as a kind of Spartan triumph. But what I'd like you to think of is the real Spartan victory, distinctively Spartan, in this phase of resistance to a massive Persian attempt to incorporate the Greeks of the Greek mainland into the largest then Oriental empire, this is before the unification of China, into an empire which already included many Greeks living in what's now the western coast of Turkey. And it's possibly not so well known, but actually probably more Greeks fought on the Persian side in the Greco-Persian wars than fought on the Greek side, because by no means every Greek city that could have done signed up to the resistance to Persia. And I'm going to come back to that point later on. For the moment, I'm going to transport you from Delphi, which is where this monument was originally set up, to where it's currently located and where it was photographed for the purpose of this slide. And that is Constantinopolis, the city of Constantine, now called Istanbul. And it's there because when Constantine founded his new Rome in a city that originally we called Byzantium, he wanted to link himself to the greater glories of the ancient Greek past. He wanted, well, we can think, can't we, of other modern countries which similarly attempt to link some monument, some person in the past to validate, to shore up, really, the self-image of the newly created political entity. So in this case, the Christian Byzantine Empire. Delphi, the most spiritually significant place in the entirety of ancient pre-Christian Greece. This serpent column, as it's called, commemorated the victory of the United Greeks, a few of them, against Xerxes and his invading Persians in 479. And around the coils were inscribed, and it starts off in left to right, so right to left, so counter to the normal way in which inscriptions are written left to right. And this is perhaps in honor of the first name, which is Hoi Lacedaemonioi, the Spartans. 32 or 33 peoples, cities, which united as Hoi Hellenes, the Hellenes, against the invading Persians. But that was not enough for Constantine. He wasn't going to be prepared to leave it in Delphi. All that survives is what you see, plus that snake's head, because the original monument culminated in 3 snakes' heads at the top, which supported a golden bowl, which in the 4th century, so about 140 odd years later, was taken down, melted down by the local people called the Phocians, because they wanted the gold to cash, to make it into coin, to pay mercenaries in a battle that they were fighting against the Macedonians for control of Delphi. So a major, it was called the Holy War, and it wasn't conducted in a very holy manner. Prepare for glory. So going back to the Thermopylae experience, which has generated immense box office, as we now say, beginning in 2007, and on the back of which one of the books that Jonathan mentioned of mine sold more than 20,000 copies in hardback, which is, for an ancient history book, believe me, that's extremely surprising. And I don't know what you think about this, but I quite admired the technology. It's filmed entirely, with one exception, by the blue screen method within a studio, and then all the weapons, the blood, whatever, these are all added in by computer afterwards. There's no actual arrows flying around in the air or blood flowing out of people's bodies. The one scene shot outside the studio involved a galloping horse, and it's very difficult to film a galloping horse inside a studio. And my one contribution to the silver screen was made in the context of this movie. I received an email out of the blue, and we had a phone call following up from Montreal, where actually the film was made. And they asked me, how do you pronounce certain Greek words? You know, we want to use them and so on. And by the way, one of them was not Thermopylae. In case you've not noticed, that word is never used in the entire film. It's much too difficult to pronounce. And they said, okay, Leonidas, how would you recommend that we pronounce him in the film? Well, I said, there are three possibilities. Supposing you were to take the English, the British line, well, we call him Leonidas. The accent is pro-paroxeton, as well, Leonidas. Suppose, on the other hand, you took, as the makers of the 300 Spartans, which was actually the model for this film, in 1962, they had called him, and it was, of course, an American actor, Leonidas, Richard Egan, Leonidas. So I said, be bold, go for it, pronounce him the way the modern Greeks, the contemporary Greeks, Leonidas. And, well, the rest is history, he's Leonidas. So that's how the impact that I've had on the Spartan tradition is minimal in terms of its movie expression. Following the huge success of 300, and I'll show you shortly one group of, in particular, Americans with whom the movie was especially successful, the filmmakers made the terrible mistake of doing, as it were, 302. And so here we actually have, in the same year, 480 BC, this is the naval side of the resistance to Persia. So Thermopylae is a land battle, it's a defeat. The following, within a month or so, there's a terrific naval battle in which the Athenians are the principal architects and actually executants of the naval victory at Salamis. And I'm sorry to say that Herodotus actually says that the Athenians, by winning the battle of Salamis, they are truly to be called the saviors of Hellas. In other words, downgrading the Spartans to secondary saviors, therefore diminishing Plataea, which we've just looked at, the serpent column and so on, in favour of the Battle of Salamis. Anyway, the filmmakers thought, well, this is great, this is a victory. And they chose, I don't know, some Australian hunk, more like a bodybuilder than an actor, to play Themistocles, the smartest, wiliest Exignos. You know, he's not a beefcake, he's a thinker, not a wrestler. Anyway, he was dreadful throughout. And at one point he manages to quite literally get it together, get it on with a queen, a Greek woman, fighting under Xerxes on the Persian side, Artemisia. At another point, you see, of course in CGI, horses galloping from one trireme to another. Unbelievably awful. I made the mistake of seeing it in an IMAX film. And so here I was being blasted by arrows, blood dripping down the screen and so on. The sex was absolutely, I thought it should have had the highest rating of forbidden. It was graphic in all the worst senses. So anyway, that's what the Spartan traditional myth or legend can be reduced to if you're not careful. rather more elevating. And this is a question mark, isn't it? I mean, I personally, I was born at such a point that I have never had to do national service. I have never had, therefore, to be faced with the possibility of killing someone else in the name of my country, which presumed that it would be acting in the correct way. Anthony Snodgrass, for example, we mentioned, he did his national service in Cyprus at a time when the Cypriot Greeks were not thrilled to be subjects of the British Crown. And there was a very strong insurrectionist, liberationist movement, and British national servicemen straight out of university or just before going to university were having to face the possibility of killing Cypriot Greeks. Well, I, thank goodness, never had to do that. But I do concede that there is a case for the military, including elite forces. And one of, I believe, the most admirable in terms of their efficiency and in terms sometimes of their function is the US Marines. And oddly enough, at one point I suddenly received a request from a Marine commander in New York State. Would I please sign 9 copies of the book that Jonathan mentioned, The Spartans, in its American subtitle, The Warrior Heroes of the Ancient World, or something like that. And I thought, yes, okay, because I know that Marines, some Marines, believe that the discipline they subject themselves to, the drill, the self-denial, the really, making life very tough for themselves so that they can contemplate facing almost any conditions. Well, the Marines have a Spartan tradition. And these books, I think, quite bear out that thought. And I started off with dark sides, and I'm going to move on to penultimately a couple of less, in my opinion, admirable sides of the Spartan myth, legend, tradition. You may have noticed on the statue of Leonidas, both in Thermopylae and its copy in Sparta, the legend, 2 words, very laconic, molon labe. Molon is the nearest participle. It's a very unusual Greek word. It's not the usual Greek word for come or go. Labe is perfectly okay. It's the second person singular, take. And as you've seen there on the handout, Plutarch sayings of the Spartans, it's attributed to none other than Leonidas, Leonidas, Leonidas. Xerxes says, come on, you stupid Spartans, you've got no chance. Drop your weapons, surrender your weapons, and give in. And the reply is 2 words, but notice in English it's in 4 words. Molon labe, come and get them. Well, I've put on the screen on the side here, and I could have chosen many more illustrations, but the gun groups, people who insist on a particular reading of the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, leaving out the point about militia, which precedes the right to bear arms. They are very proud to see themselves as, in some sense, as the descendants of, or in the same ballpark as the Spartans, who uttered that word to the Persians in utterly different circumstances. And one of the things that's very puzzling to us Brits is the fact that arms bearing in public, not just the possession of them, as let's say in Switzerland, but walking around with them in supermarkets is permitted. And not only permitted, but legally enshrined and so on in a number of states. We find this very difficult. And I suggested that if Thucydides, through a time machine, could be brought back to 2015 America and told that this was the case in one of the most developed, sophisticated democracies in the entire world, he would say, well, look what I wrote in Book 1, Chapter 6. And I'm talking about the Aetolians, who, my God, they carry weapons in peacetime, in public. And this for him is a sign of barbarism. To be Greek is to be civilized. We've got beyond carrying weapons in public, weapons are for war, ideally against external enemies, not against our fellow citizens. So, this is, I think, an unfortunate inflection of the Spartan tradition. Even more unfortunate, in my opinion, is this, and to me even more extraordinary than the last phenomenon. In other words, I find this really difficult to get my head around. Here is a mass rally of a party in Greece, calls itself Golden Dawn Chrysiavgi, and one can see why they worship the ancient Spartans, what they think about ancient Sparta, hostility to foreigners in particular, is in their terms admirable and a kind of validation of their own view. But the Spartans, the real Spartans, in the 1940s, suffered, as many other Greeks, one of the most brutal occupations there has been in Europe. And I have a friend, he's in Berkeley, and his name is Leonidas, and he is Spartan. His older brother was killed by the occupying Nazis because his brother was a resistant to, he's written a fictionalized version of this account. Well, that's only 70 years ago. 2+ generations. There are still people alive, like Leonidas, who was a young boy at the time of the German occupation. Here are Greeks celebrating in a Nuremberg rally style at Thermopylae, which was the defeat. Their adherence to an ideology which they link on to, something which actually I don't think was particularly good for Greece. And in particular at a time now, I went to a lecture yesterday by Gregor Gysi, born in Berlin, 1948, East Berlin, brought up under the East German state. When reunification happened in 1990, he successfully made the transition to becoming a democratic politician of what he calls a democratic socialist kind. Well, the discussion yesterday at UIC was about, in particular, within the European Union, the relationship between Germany and Greece. Well, it's been checkered, shall we say. When the Greeks got their independence, the Greeks in the audience know this terribly well, from the Turks, they had foisted upon them a Bavarian king by the great powers. So in that sense, not so good, the relation. On the other hand, at the very same moment, scholars in England, in Germany, and particularly in Germany, were celebrating the fact that we, in the 19th century, heirs to the Enlightenment, which went back through the Renaissance, through Rome, ultimately to the great glories of ancient Greece, we are the European descendants of those ancient Greeks. So, in the 19th century, on the one hand, there is, as it were, a tyranny of Greece as an idea over European intellectuals. On the other hand, in reality, Greeks who just liberated themselves from a very long and probably not very pleasant occupation, 400 years, suddenly found themselves under a German king. So you can see why attitudes to Germany are ambivalent, and what happened in the Second World War is still an extremely fresh memory. When I first went to Crete, I was walking along the road and I asked the way to a particular place, and I'm blonde and I can easily pass for a German, and I asked the Greek in whatever it was, Feston, I think, and he said to me, Germanos iste, in a very menacing manner, are you German? And I said, Anglos, Anglos. And he beamed a huge smile and sort of embraced me, and that was, admittedly, that was only 1970, so we're only 25 years, 26 years on from the occupation. So this is heavy stuff, and I don't want to end on an entirely heavy note. So I'm going to end on a slightly lighter one. Are there any tennis fans? Anybody? There are many fans. Well, you will all know who won the men's singles at Flushing Meadows this year. Novak Djokovic. Now, what did he do to celebrate his victory? He rushed into the stands. Where was his old mate, Gerard Butler, a.k.a. Leonidas of 300? They, in unison, side by side, roared out this is Sparta! So at least they were celebrating a victory, unlike some of the others we've looked at. So if you have been, thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have almost 15 minutes or so for questions.
Thanks, Steve. You said more about the distinct role of Spartan women due to the existence of the productive lots.
Yeah, it's a deep story. 300, I could have mentioned it then when I saw the clock ticking on, but you probably remember, or if you've seen it. Yeah.
Yes, the non-vulnerable.
Not the vulnerable, but the less vulnerable. Well, in that, Nina Heady, English, playing Gorgo, which means Gorgon. Gorgo was the wife of a king and the daughter of a king. Wife of Leonidas, and daughter of Cleomenes the Plus. Well, in the movie, she's given a quite prominent role throughout, but at one point, Leonidas is off to Thermopylae, and there's grumblings back at home. They're not sure he's doing the right thing. So she thinks, right, okay, I'm going to rally the troops back home. I'm going to stop this criticism of my husband, who's taking these people off, and I'm going to address the Spartan assembly. That would have been physically impossible, literally impossible. No woman was politically empowered in Sparta any more than any woman was politically empowered in any classical Greek city, or indeed any Hellenistic Greek city, or indeed any Roman Greek city. And so, as we know, women's rights have been extremely slow to be recognised in political terms, equal political rights. And in antiquity, there was an ambivalence towards Spartan women, such as Gorgo. Now, I quoted what's alleged to be a saying of Leonidas, Mollo Labi, sayings of Spartan men. But in the same work, Plutarch has a section, sayings of Spartan women. And among those who are credited with, they're probably all invented by non-Spartan men. Nevertheless, they're meant to be symbolically revealing, is one attributed to Gorgo. So a foreign woman, a non-Spartan Greek woman, comes up to Gorgo in some imagined scenario and says, Gorgo, how come that you Spartan women, alone of all Greek women, rule your men? Now, if you think that's just a fantastic thought, it can't be that anybody ever really thought that Spartan women ruled their... Read Aristotle, Politics, Book 2. He has a whole litany of complaints against the undue power and influence of Spartan women, which he says at one point amounts to a gunokratia, a rule of women over the men. Anyway, what's Gorgo's reply? She neatly sidesteps the issue directly and says, the reason, you know, is because we alone of all Greek women produce real men. So in other words, no other Greek woman could rule their men because they didn't produce men, only they, Spartan women, produced Spartan men. And that actually captures, I think, something very significant, that if you're going to have a society like Sparta, a smallish population dominating a much larger servile force like the Hells, the female half of the population have to be on side with the dominant ethos, which was indeed a dominant masculine ethos. This is a warrior society. Spartan women didn't fight, though interestingly the female goddesses that the Spartans worshipped were represented in armour. So, you know, it's like Athena in Athens. She's always represented in armour. So why were the Spartan women thus differentially empowered and, I would say, liberated? Well, ultimately it seems to come down to property. But whereas in all, or pretty much all, other Greek cities, women could at most own, as it were, their private possession, a few clothes and so on. They couldn't really own real property, fields, estates, houses. Spartan women were apparently entitled to inherit on all fours, in other words, in equal amounts and ways with their brothers, real property. And Aristotle in particular singles this out. He says 2/5 of the private land in Sparta is owned by women. Deeply shocking to him. Yeah.
The image of Spartans and what they're the warriors and the culture it stands for, from ancient times to today, did it ever change or adjust? You know, different periods of
Well,
history?
one of the things I do in my book on Odysseus is track his legend. In other words, look at all the references to him in antiquity, and then in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, early modern period, down to the 20th century. And he's slightly odd because he was lame, and lame from birth. And there's a very strong tradition in Sparta that at birth, infants were inspected very rigorously, especially male, to see whether they had any physical defects that might in the end prevent them, or at least diminish their capacity to join the heavy-armed infantry army. So how did Odysseus get away with, as it were, not being exposed? Well, it may be that when he was young, it actually didn't show up that he was lame. Also, it's the fact that when he was adult, though he, like that, he hobbled, nevertheless it didn't impede him from actually fighting as a heavy-armed infantryman in battle. And so he became, and this is thanks actually ironically to an Athenian called Xenophon. He is represented as an ideal Spartan. He personally embodies every Spartan virtue, which Xenophon the Athenian thought should be the virtues of the Athenians, but they didn't have it. And how had he become such an exemplary Spartan? Well, of course, he's of royal birth, so he starts off powerful, genetic endowment. But he then goes through, he wasn't expected to become king, and he goes through the usual Spartan educational regime that all Spartan boys went through from the age of 7 to the age of 18, extremely rigorous and mainly physical. And he passed through with honours, as it were, summa cum laude. So he was a Spartan in more than the sense of just he was born a Spartan and he was a Spartan royal. He was a creative Spartan, he was a cultural Spartan. And for that reason he could act, he could be used as an exemplar of what it is to be Spartan. So you can track through, there are periods in European cultural tradition, Elizabeth Rawson, where more intellectual qualities were privileged over physical, martial qualities. So, for example, Voltaire was not at all keen on the ancient Spartans, where, oddly enough, Rousseau was. They're contemporaries, and they're both, as it were, founding fathers of the French Revolution, both intellectuals. But whereas Rousseau loved the fact that Spartans lived a very ordered life, they obeyed the laws that he believed had been laid down for them by their lawgiver, Lycurgus. The Athenians were much more, in Rousseau's view, self-indulgent, self-centered, all that stuff. For Voltaire, the exact opposite. He was much happier with the Athenian way. Luxury was good because it produces better trade, goods, better lives, and Spartans were anti-intellectual for him. That was a bad thing. They were sort of automatons, not free-thinking spirits.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question about Thermopylae.
Yeah.
And in particular, I don't know if you are familiar, you probably are, with this poem by Konstantinos Kavafis, which has exactly the title Thermopylae, and which symbolizes this perception of the modern Greek of what Thermopylae may mean, and namely, this, although it was a defeat, as you said, and in any objective means and interpretation was a defeat. At the same time, it symbolizes the spirit of resistance or the spirit of fighting for an idea, even though you may know that the outcome may be a negative one, and I'm sure that Leonidas and the rest did. Of course, at the time, and I don't know and I don't know if it can be known exactly what the background was on Sparta, there was a realistic chance that they would win too. It wasn't like a suicide mission, right?
Well, we can argue about that. In my opinion, there was no chance of them holding them up for
At least they held them for a while, or at least
That's
that's
it.
what I learned.
That's
and
it.
At the end, it was the betrayal by Ephialtes
Ah.
that led, and this is also brought up.
Path.
Right, and that, this is also brought up in Cavafis' poem.
It is.
Right,
And
because
it ends with that.
and it ends. So I wanted you to comment a little bit on
Yeah.
this.
Well, I mean, partly it backs up what I was saying, that unfortunately Greeks then were not entirely united. Many thought that the Persians were bound to win. So what do you do in that situation? You either join them, which is what Ephialtes decided to do, or you try to stay neutral, so that after the victory is over, at least you're not going to be victimized as having resisted. And so the majority of Greeks in the mainland of Greece did not join with the Spartans and the Athenians in physically resisting in battle the Persian invasion. For example, the people of Argos did not. And so what Ephialtes represents is a local rivalry. He came from Marlis, which is next door to where Thermopylae is in focus. And therefore the Malians, the Phocians have decided to fight for resistance, and very often my neighbour is my enemy, or my enemy's enemy is my friend, and therefore it wouldn't have been entirely surprising. Ephialtes would have perhaps not been an unusual Malian in going over to the Persians and saying, I can show you a way round the back which will enable you to capture the Spartans and their allies in a pincer movement bottled up between the two ends of the pass. And he went to do this for money. So he was interested in cash reward. And after the conflict was over, the Spartans put out a detail to catch him, to assassinate him, like a murder squad, just to make sure that he didn't survive his act of treachery. As Jonathan says, the path was known to Leonidas. He'd actually posted 1,000 Phocians on this path, and it's still a bit of a mystery. How did the Persian force get by without the Phocians seeming to realize it's in the middle of the night, but it's a clear night, there's a moon. So, there's a rustling of leaves. The story as told is that they'd gone past before the Phocian guard was awake enough to realize the force was coming up this path. But whatever the truth, the path was known, and so it's not that it was a total surprise, but it's how it was betrayed that is the point of Cavafis' poem, who says there will always be. I mean, it's very realistic, really. I mean, don't expect too much of human nature in a situation like that, where the odds are overwhelming against success for the Greeks in this case. There will always be somebody who will come through to make the best of a very bad job. That's Cavafis' sort of disillusioned sort of conclusion. But it starts, as you rightly say, with the sort of
honor,
honor and glory to those who resist. Exactly.
There were actually 3 battles at Thermopylae. The really bizarre thing is on each occasion the enemy found the back path. One final question, sir.
Yes, at the top of this leadership of Spartan women came the fact that we were to bear arms, to keep Hellas in check when the army was in the field.
Yes, that's a very interesting. In Herodotus, the Spartans take with them, allegedly, for every one Spartan, 7 helmets. Well, each Spartan doesn't need 7 to carry his equipment, cook for him, wash, dress his wounds, so on. So there's a thought, and this is not made explicit in Herodotus, but it is made explicit in Thucydides, talking about another war, when Greeks are fighting Greeks, the Peloponnesian War, that the Spartans are so afraid of the Hells, if they go out in significant numbers from Sparta, that there will be discontent, uprising. So you take as many as you can decently handle, and you take them with you so that they don't cause trouble in your rear when you're away from home for a good period. Then I mentioned Xenophon, he's an Athenian, but he lived in Sparta and he knew Spartans he's like me, if you like, an honorary citizen of Sparta. And he tells us that when Spartans were on campaign, they had an arms dump, as it were. So Spartans didn't sleep each with their own shield and spear and so on, but they put them in a common pound, like a bicycle park or whatever. But they had a way of taking off the handle from the shield. The way you carry a shield is there's a handle like that, and you put your arm through and then you grab a leather grip at the end. So they took off that so that the Helots could not pick up and use the shields on campaign. And it does suggest quite a serious concern about Helots being the enemy within, as it were. And it is a puzzling feature, but for the Spartans winning the Battle of Plataea, there would possibly not have been the kind of development of democracy, scientific thought, philosophy, theatre that we associate with Athens. Because had the Persians won, they would not have tolerated the kind of political system that the Athenians had developed and would develop further, partly by defeating the Persians. So the Spartans enabled that flowering of classical Greek culture, yet at home they were, well, what shall we say, the enemies of liberty. They were certainly repressing the liberties of the Helots. And the ad I began with, the Spartans were defeated. Well, within 18 months of that defeat, their first major defeat ever in any battle, the Helots of Messenia, the southwest Peloponnese, rose up with the help especially of Thebans, my hero Epaminondas, and they broke away, they achieved their own emancipation, liberation, their own city, after maybe 300, maybe 400 years of being the slaves of the Spartans. So the history of ancient Greek liberty is a very complicated, complex thing.
I'm sure Paul will be happy to entertain more informal questions over the reception, so long as you make sure he has a glass in his hand. But let us thank Paul Cartledge once again.